there seemed to be a real, genuine will from the government to engage with the IMF seriously. And they had just drafted the economic reform plan. The reform plan, for the first time ever, you know, defined or showed what the losses in the Lebanese financial
Right.
sector were.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there seemed to be a genuine will to engage with the IMF and reform, and use this money to start building a productive economy and reforming the public sector and decreasing public debt, etc. Um, but what we wanted to make sure was that human rights weren't sidelined in the negotiations between the IMF and the Lebanese government.
Hmm.
So the IMF's, its ultimate aim is it's going to give a loan to a country, but the IMF wants its money back, right? It wants to ensure that the country it's giving its money to is able to then pay the money back.
Yeah.
That's in a nutshell the IMF's purpose.
Yeah.
The way that they've done it in previous countries is, you need to decrease the deficit, you need to decrease the debt. So, quite, common sense. You decrease government spending and you increase government revenue. And the way that they've done this in other contexts is increase government revenue through increasing taxes, decrease government spending through austerity, privatization, decreasing spending on social services.
Hmm.
What we were trying to say in Lebanon is that this formula here is not going to work.
Because it'll hit the hardest hit, right? It'll be
exactly.
Yeah.
It'll hit the hardest hit. So already Lebanon is a country with a very poor safety net. Already marginalized communities are suffering a lot under the economic crisis, and they're paying the highest price for the economic crisis. But in Lebanon, we also have a sectarian system and a clientelist network where, because the state has not provided quality access to education, to healthcare, to work, you have to rely on your sectarian leader for access to these very basic services that the state should be providing. So if the IMF were to come and say, okay, we're going to decrease spending, already insufficient spending on these vital public services, what it's going to do is make people even more dependent on their sectarian leaders who, because of the way that the system is set up, are resistant to change.
Right.
So what we wanted to do is ensure that they prioritized rights. So that includes, not imposing regressive taxes, which are taxes that are applied on everybody equally. And an example of that is the VAT tax.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Everybody, then poor, rich, you all pay the same VAT tax.
Right.
A progressive tax that places a higher burden on the rich rather than the poor would make much more sense in Lebanon, particularly in a country where the rich actually pay very little taxes, and improve the tax collection infrastructure. So before you even look at increasing taxes on poor people, make sure that the taxes that you already do have are being collected, because tax evasion is notorious in Lebanon. So that's one set of recommendations. And then the other, bucket falls into the decreasing government revenues. So some of the recommendations that we've heard being floated around are cut public sector, remove subsidies to the electricity sector.
Yeah.
But those could also end up disproportionately harming the poor. So what we wanted to stress for the IMF is the need to have an alternative before you, for example, remove subsidies for the electricity sector. And that includes, a comprehensive reform plan for the electricity sector that ensures that everybody's able to access electricity. Once you have this access, then you can start decreasing the subsidies and supplementing them with directed subsidies to the poorest so that they're able to afford access to electricity.
Do you sense, though, that if let's say the balance sheet at the end of the day is the priority for the IMF, do you see what you're saying fitting into the negotiations, or is it largely absent? I know that I'm not asking. I mean, I'm assuming you're not there at the negotiations roundtable, sort of. But I mean, is it their concern at this point, or do you see it as a non-issue? And I mean it on both sides, the Lebanese side and the IMF.
Of course. So for the IMF, I mean, we've seen in recent years that they have started paying more attention to impacts on social fabric of society. They've started paying more attention to issues of corruption. So I do see that they're would be a genuine will from the IMF to engage very seriously around these issues.
Okay.
Because ultimately they would help put Lebanon on a more sustainable development path, which would ultimately enable Lebanon to pay the debts that it owes the IMF. So it's, in the end, it is about the numbers.
Right.
But, our argument is that this is given Lebanon's social fabric and the situation of Lebanon, this makes much more sense for creating the conditions of a sustainable economy than, very, very deep austerity measures and like
Right.
a traditional austerity IMF program.